Yesterday morning, I made a prediction about a speech the president was expected to give later in the day. I said we could expect him to announce a plan to impose the will of some of his most radical backers on the American middle class. I said he'd be undeterred by Congress' rejection of his national energy tax, even when Democrats held commanding majorities in both houses. I said he'd announce his intention to push through job-crushing regulations anyway, but this time largely through the back door, over the objections of many working-class Americans, rather than through the regular democratic process. And lo and behold, that's essentially what he did. I was surprised by one thing, though, and that was his continued effort to play politics with the Keystone Pipeline jobs. Remember, we all know that the oil this pipeline would carry is going to come out of the ground either way. It is going to come out of the ground, whether he approves it or not. In other words, whether he gives approval to the pipeline or not, the oil is coming out of the ground. The only question is whether that energy and those jobs will go to America or whether they will be allowed to travel across the Pacific to governments that harbor terrible environmental records to begin with. That's just one reason why the Keystone Pipeline has enjoyed such broad bipartisan support here in the Senate. And even big labor, a sector that's usually supportive of the president, is all behind the Keystone Pipeline. And yet yesterday, when the president had the opportunity to side with the working class families across the country by approving the pipeline, he took another pass, just took a pass. Sometimes you just have to wonder about this administration. In making decisions like these, you got to wonder if they truly understand the worries that most Americans have to contend with in the Obama economy. I've long warned, for example, that the White House was determined to wage a war on coal. They denied it, of course, but only just long enough to get through the last election. So it's not a coincidence that the president didn't give his speech before the election, or that he gave it at a university that symbolizes the D.C. elite, rather than somewhere in coal country. Should have made this speech down at Morehead State University in my state, or the University of Pikeville in my state. That would have been a place to make the speech, not here in town. Now the president's supporters seem all too happy to admit that there's a war on coal. Just yesterday, an advisor to the White House said, quote, and I've got it right here on this chart I'm asking my staff to hold up. A White House advisor says a war on coal is exactly what is needed. You have to give him points for candor. A war on coal is exactly what is needed, said a White House advisor. Look, Republicans are all for developing the fuels and the energies of the future. We're all for that. We just think that it should come about as part of an all-of-the-above strategy, which is exactly what the White House said it supported too back before the election. But now with the election year over, the truth comes out. And in truth, the administration seems to adhere to a dogma that could best be described as none of the above. Not all of the above, but none of the above, except a couple of things that make our base happy. None of the above, except a couple of things that make our base happy. I'd note that such an approach is basically nonsense, since it ignores what's necessary to keep our country growing. Energy needs have to be met in order to move toward a future where renewables look set to play a greater role, because it simply tries to pretend that it will not take years, if not decades, for these other types of energy to come online in a way that will truly meet our energy needs. In a phrase, it's a strategy that subordinates almost everything to politics. That's why Republicans believe a true all-of-the-above strategy means developing wind and solar and natural gas and oil and coal, and embracing American jobs that come along with producing American energy. And here's what we believe it absolutely does not mean. It does not mean picking out a class of vulnerable people and declaring war on them. picking out a class of vulnerable people and declaring war on them. I mean, there's a depression in central Appalachia, which includes eastern Kentucky, because of the government itself, this administration. Sometimes people in Washington forget that decisions made here actually affect the lives of others. And I'm often left to wonder, do they just not care? Do they just not care? Of course, coal is an important industry to my state, and I'm going to defend Kentucky workers from out-of-touch Washington attacks, but it's pretty naive to think it's just about Kentucky or West Virginia or Pennsylvania. As I said yesterday, a war on coal is actually a war on jobs. A war on coal is a war on jobs. Coal is important to our entire country. It's critical to the growth of manufacturing, and it's important to our national economy. One could say that a coal miner in Kentucky relies on coal for their well-being, just as a line worker at a manufacturing plant that uses coal relies on it too. And pretty much anyone who lives or works in a building with electricity relies on coal in some way. That's why even some in the president's party are trying to distance themselves from his approach. As one of my Senate Democratic colleagues put it yesterday, quote, "The fact is clear. Our own Energy Department reports that our country will get 37% of our energy from coal until 2040. That's this administration's Energy Department. Removing coal from our energy mix will have disastrous consequences for our recovering economy." I couldn't agree more with that Democratic colleague, and it's time for the White House to stop pivoting from job-destroying policies to campaign-style PR pitches for jobs right back to job-destroying policies. It's time for the administration to get serious about pursuing a truly workable strategy for this country, for energy, for the economy, and for jobs.